Hi there! So today we're going to real quick go over the knit stitch and get you guys started on your knitting. You should have a ball of yarn and some knitting needles, and you should have already cast on your stitches as I have done here. If you're still struggling with casting on, I do have a video of the long tail cast on method, the most common cast on method out there on my page. I'll go ahead and link that in this video for you. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. So I have some live stitches on my left hand needle here, and my right hand needle is going to be empty, and that is how I will hold them. Live stitches left, empty right, and we're going to work left to right. Now I do have my working yarn that's kind of feeding from my ball here up into my work. My working yarn, when I'm working the knit stitch, should always be held to the back of my stitches. Separate that from the tail here. As you can see, I like to knot up my leftover tail so I don't have to worry about accidentally grabbing that and using that instead of my working yarn. All right, so I'll go ahead and hold that out of the way so you guys can see here. All right, so we want to make sure that our working yarn is towards the back of our work when we're working the knit stitch. And you want to make sure that you're bringing it to the back underneath the needle, not over the top. So if you can see here, I have these stitches kind of sitting on my needle. And if I bring this yarn over the top, I'm actually flipping that stitch over, and I'm not going to be able to knit into that, all right? So I want to take my working yarn and always bring it to the back underneath my needle in order to work the knit stitch. So I use the continental style of knitting. I pick my yarn. The other is the English style, which is throwing your yarn. So I like to keep my working yarn in my right hand and pick it up. English would be throwing. We throw the yarn from our left hand around the needle. So I take my working yarn. I like to have some nice control as it feeds off my ball of yarn. I don't want it to just go all willy-nilly all over the place. And I also like to be able to kind of control that stitch as it goes onto the needle and maintain tension throughout the project. So I'm going to take this working yarn here, lay it over my palm. I'm going to wrap it around my hand, bring it back up, and I'm going to take my index finger and come underneath of that. The rest of my fingers here are just going to kind of loosely wrap around and take hold of that left hand needle, okay? Now I have a nice control of that working yarn as it feeds up, and I've also got control of my yarn that I'm going to use to knit with, all right? So as you can see, we've got our live stitches here, and we want to make sure that we keep them pretty close to the edge of the needle. You don't want them so close that they're in danger of falling off before you actually knit them, but you don't want to start with them all the way down at the end of the needle, because that's just going to be a nightmare to get them towards the end and up and over in order to knit. So towards the end of the needle, to make it easier and go a little bit faster. So I am actually going to bring these just a little bit closer here. Now, our stitches here on the needle, you can actually see this is a little loop here, and if I turn this, it's a loop on my needle, okay? So we've got the right side of our first stitch, and we've got our left side of that first stitch. I'm gonna take my right hand needle, the needle that doesn't have any stitches on it, and from the left hand side of that first stitch, I'm gonna go in and come through the back, and now I want to be on the right side. So I'm actually going into this stitch on the needle from the left coming out on the right. If I were to go into the left and come out on the left, I'm actually in between these two stitches, and I don't want to be in between those two stitches. I actually want to be in this stitch on the needle here. All right, so in through the left, come out through the right. I'm going to take my working yarn here, I'm going to wrap it around the needle, and now I just like to take my index finger on my right hand and kind of loosely hold that as I pull that loop through the stitch on my left hand needle, okay? Then I'm going to take that stitch on my left hand needle, this here, and I'm going to slide it off the needle. Okay, and I'm just going to give it a little tug for some tension so it's not a gaping hole left on the needle here. All right, so here we go again. We're going to go in from the left, through the stitch, and come out on the right. Okay, I'm going to wrap my yarn, little anchor on it, bring that needle through the stitch. So now I have a new stitch on my right hand needle, and I'm going to lift that stitch on the left hand needle off. Again, in through the left, through the stitch on the needle, come out on the right, wrap my yarn, pull it through, and then slide that old stitch off the left hand needle. Okay, I'm going to bring these back stitches up a little bit closer. In through the left, come out on the right, wrap my yarn, pull that through, and then slide it off the needle. So you can see I'm starting to create new stitches over on my right hand needle from the old stitches on my left hand needle. Wrap my yarn, pull that through. Okay, so here we go. To the left of the stitch, into the stitch with that right hand needle, come out in the back on the right hand side, wrap your working yarn around the right hand needle, anchor that yarn so it doesn't slide off. You're going to take that right hand needle, it's going to come through, pull it through to the front. Now you have a new stitch on the right hand needle, take that old stitch on the left and slide it off. Get a little bit of tension in there. All right, so I'm going to finish out this row here, and then we're going to talk about what we do after we get to the end of our row. So I have tried the English method of knitting, throwing your yarn, and I look like I'm all thumbs when I try and do it. This is just the way I learned, and this is the way that my fingers naturally move when it comes to knitting. Okay, so I got a couple left here, so I'm gonna go into the left, wrap my yarn, pull that through, okay? Wrap, pull it through. Okay, got a couple stitches left here. Here's our last one. Okay, so again to the left, through that stitch on the needle, come out the back on the right hand side, wrap your yarn, give it a little anchor, bring that needle through the old stitch, creating a new stitch, and then slide that stitch off the left hand needle. Okay, so now we have all of these new stitches on our right hand needle, and our left hand needle is empty. Now I did say we always work left to right, so we need to take these stitches and get them back to our left hand. So all I'm going to do is, here's my right hand needle, I'm going to turn, and there we go. My right hand needle has now become my left hand needle. My what was left hand needle is now my new empty right hand needle, and I'm able to start knitting again. So I would simply make sure that my working yarn is towards the back. I'm going to wrap that, and I would start knitting. So with the knit stitch, a couple of quick things here. What we're doing is taking this little loop that's sitting on our needles and flipping it to the back. So you know you're knitting if the bumps, so these bumps here are to the back. So if I turn this over, my bumps are in back of my needle, okay? They're not in front. You could continue, if you cast on and continue to knit, and just knit across, back and forth across your rows. You get what we call garter stitch. And I'll actually show you here. So you can kind of see it starting to form here. But let me go ahead and show you just a project here. So this is just garter stitch back and forth. And if you were to cast on and just keep knitting, knitting, knitting all your rows, you're gonna get this garter stitch, a bunch of little bumps, okay? It's kind of a rougher knit look, but perfectly acceptable for your very first scarf. If you want to cast on and just knit until the very end and then cast off, you'll have a nice little garter stitch scarf. The other stitch involved in knitting is the purl stitch, and that is where we bring those bumps and now keep them to the front of our work. But that we're going to save for another video. So tune back in next week to learn the purl stitch. Thanks.